Good evening. We'll be getting started at 5 after the hour. Greetings. We'll get started at 5 after the hour. We'll be starting in 1 minute. Good evening and welcome to the Masonic Seminar Series. My name is Brother Katie Kumsie and I am your presenter for this platform. I'm joined in the office here with Brother Patrick Alessandra and Brother Benjamin Hartle, who are running our various ITs. So Brother Hartle will be running the Zoom platform and Brother Patrick will be the voice of all the other platforms that we're streaming from. So I want to welcome everyone on this it's Monday. It's already Monday. I was thinking it was Tuesday, but it's Monday. Welcome. I hope everyone has had a wonderful month in the time that I have not seen you, and I hope that you will find tonight's presentation somewhat edifying. The Masonic Seminar Series was and is created by Universal Co-Masonry, which is Freemasonry for men and women, and it is our outreach program to all the various individuals who are interested in becoming Freemasons. The purpose is to provide a groundwork of understanding without giving any insight to the rituals that we have, as we keep those confidential. And the purpose for that is so that each person can have the experience that they need to have if they decide to join or initiated into Masonry. We're one of two outreaches from Universal Co-Masonry. The other one is the Masonic Philosophical Society, which is a discussion-based platform. If you're not familiar with it, feel free to email myself, or you can check in with Brother Hartle or Brother Patrick, and they can give you the information, as well as Brother Rosario, who's also on this meeting tonight. She has the information for MPS as well. So we have lots of places for you to get information. So I hope that you'll take us up on our offer. We have videos and podcasts as well, and books that we recommend. We are full of resources. So any question, we will try to help you answer. The Masonic Seminar Series is an episodic adventure, meaning that each month is a different topic. So if you are joining us for the first time, welcome. You aren't going to be behind because I don't necessarily reference previous months, just so that way we can all stay on the same page. All right. Without further ado, we will get started. This evening, we will be talking about the measure of man. And I want to say that I took a different approach. Originally, when I started crafting this particular presentation, I was going to do sacred geometry specifically and look at various parts of sacred geometry, the different ones that are out there. But I decided to go deeper. Instead of doing a 30,000 or 15,000 foot view, I decided to go to a 3-inch view, 3-foot view to help lay the foundation work. So if you are extremely versed in sacred geometry, hopefully you will learn something with the fundamentals. And if you're not versed, then that's fine too, because again, we'll just be working on fundamentals tonight. So this evening, we have one purpose, and it's to answer the following question. Why would a system of moral and spiritual development, which is Freemasonry, place geometry at the foundation of its teachings? And I'm going to tell you where this comes from, this statement, this question. But I want to preface that when I say the word geometry, I'm not talking the empirical mathematical geometry by itself. I'm talking about geometry as a whole. So sacred geometry or mathematical geometry. They are the same here in this conversation. The reason being that we'll talk a little bit about history of geometry. In its infancy, it was a practical matter, but it also was a very philosophical matter. And then it got secularized in the late 1700s, 1800s with the era of the Enlightenment, and has remained separated, even though we see a movement to add in that philosophical and spiritual piece, and that's where sacred comes from. So this evening, I have reunited those two terms of sacred and mathematical geometry into its title, which is geometry. So from here on, for the next hour and a half, I will be talking about geometry in its totality. Okay, so the definition of Freemasonry is, I'll give it to you the second one, is a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbol. That's where that first part of that question of moral and spiritual development comes from. The first assertion, which is where geometry comes from, is geometry is the first and noblest of sciences, and the basis on which the superstructure of Freemasonry is erected. You'll see that geometry becomes a part of modern Freemasonry as early as 1723 with Anderson's constitutions, but I liked William Preston's comment better. That's why I put it in, even though it's a later date. So we're going to answer the question, why would a moral system and spiritual system place geometry at the foundation of its teachings? And we're going to reconcile these two assertions throughout the hour and a half. As we move forward, I will stop periodically for comments and questions. I would ask that we stay on topic just because we don't want to derail anything. And you can put your questions in on the Zoom platform. Brother Benjamin will read them for you. And from X and what is it? It's not Twitter anymore. X, Facebook, and YouTube. There we go, those three. Brother Patrick will be your voice. So please put your questions as we go along. We'll stop and take those. And that way we can make this more dynamic than me speaking for just an hour and a half straight. So I hope you can help me answer this question. It's one that has helped bridge two ideas that seem very ununited. They're very almost unreconcilable to each other, but indeed they are reconcilable, and that's what we're going to be doing for the next hour and a half. The one thing I want to preface, there's actually two things I'm going to preface. The first one is Freemasonry as a moral and spiritual system of development is a true statement, but it is an incomplete statement. There is way more to Masonry than self-improvement. In fact, a large part of it is going to be just the service of others, whether that's a physical, spiritual, intellectual, mental, emotional service, that depends. But we are looking to help humanity, not just ourselves. And I will often say that when we improve ourselves, it is a byproduct of what we're trying to do, which is to work for the betterment of humanity under the auspices of the great architect of the universe. The great architect of the universe being the principle, the highest creative principle in the universe, however you'd like to define that. So this is where we're going to spend the next hour and a half. Now, as I said, the first preface is that Masonry, we're talking about Masonry, we're talking about geometry, and that Freemasonry is not a system of just personal development. A lot of people think it's about to improve yourself, and yes, there's a part of that, but that's the first premise tonight, that it's more than that. The second one is that I'm not going to talk about Freemasonry for a little bit in the beginning, which is not usual. I'm going to front load it on geometry, and then I'm going to help make the jump to Freemasonry in the latter half of our presentation. So if you're like, what does this have to do with Freemasonry? Don't worry, I will build that connection for you, as I said, in the latter half. All right, so geometry literally means earth measurement. And when we look at the history, it starts back in Egypt. And it was more of a practical matter. We believe it was ancient Egypt, could have been further back. But as it comes into the Western hemisphere and Western philosophy, it comes from Egypt. And it has to do a lot with surveying properties, because with the flooding of the Nile, it kept wiping out property alignment. And so geometry was used in ancient Egypt to reestablish those every year. It would then move into Greece. And you'll see that Herodotus said that geometry did move from Egypt, ancient Egypt, into Greece. That's where we make that connection, is through the philosopher Herodotus. And geometry in Greece becomes more, and this is Pythagoras we're looking at here. Pythagoras is really interesting in regards to a spiritual and philosophic individual. We don't know a lot about him. We only know the fruits of his labor. And oftentimes other people will get credit for the things that he's done, or a greater benefit. But Pythagoras is kind of a sleeper in regards to just the impact. We feel his impact all the time, but we don't know it's from him. And Pythagoras is the one that says, I don't think it's just about surveying property lines and the limits of that. There's something more to it. There is a greater understanding of a cosmic order. So he starts to philosophize geometry. It's then through Plato that we see, excuse me, a cosmology built around geometry. He's the one that takes it a step further, or a lot of steps further than Pythagoras. He builds on that idea that it's not just property surveying, it's not just land measurements, it's a vast beginning and a vast hierarchical experience, the cosmos, the universe, Earth being a part of that. So we'll start to see that from measurement to philosophy, we start to see a cosmology, again, a creation, an understanding of how the universe was created. Then you have the heavy hitter, Euclid. Euclid, in his book, The Elements, is going to start giving us axioms and definitions and postulations. He starts to systematize the whole geometrical experience. So you have Pythagoras, who's going to philosophize it. Plato in his Timaeus is going to write about this cosmology. And then you're going to see Euclid in Elements write about the systematizing of geometry. So it goes to very philosophical and spiritual, into very numerical. It's very much number, it's measurement, it's ratios and all of that. And he writes this down. And it's important that we realize there's a formalization, because this process of observation is extremely important. And then you see that we have Freemasonry, from Euclid to Freemasonry, there's a big jump in time, and that we start to see that Masonry is going to use geometry in a certain specific way. So we have measurement in ancient Egypt. We have philosophy with Pythagoras. We have cosmology with Plato. We have that systematizing, which is, again, extremely important. You'll see why. With his book in the Elements. And then you have Freemasonry with its moral architecture. So that's a little bit of the history of geometry. And again, obviously, there's a lot of pieces in there that I didn't cover. It's just a brief survey of it. So that way we can kind of get an idea of where we're coming from, its roots. So let's talk about first principles. We've been talking about first principles a lot tonight. First principles are the very basic of an idea. You can't reduce an idea past first principles. If you can, you have not found the first principles. And so I'm going to talk about 5 first principles that have come out over the last, 2,000-3,000 years of geometry's history. The first one is unity. And unity is the principle from which all diversity originates. Each one of these first principles can be in itself its own study. It can be an hour and a half. It can be longer. Books are written on this. And so what I'm going to present to you is just a little bit of an understanding. So when we talk about the principle from which all diversity originates, this is the epicenter. It is the moment. It can be the Big Bang, if you want to call it, from a science secular perspective. It is the single source that connects all of the greater whole together. And in geometry, it's represented by a single point. Now, this is interesting because you can't do anything in geometry without a single point. A point has no dimension at all, which is interesting because it's a point. Because when you think about it, it's like, no, if I take my pen and put it on paper and make a point, it has dimension. But when you look at the concept of a point, it is dimensionless. It doesn't have any dimension because it has every dimension in it. And this, again, is the origin. The point is the origin of all geometric figures. So if you draw a line, if you do a triangle, if you do a square, any type of geometric figure you make requires points, the connection of points throughout the process. When we look at the various traditions that are coming out of ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, that Hellenistic period, we have a different name for that unity. The Pythagoreans called it the monad, the one. So if you look at the tic-tac-toe, which is 1, 2, 3, and 4, it's going to be that first point. And again, the Pythagoreans called it the monad. Platonists and Neoplatonists called it the one, and the Hermeticists call it the all. In Freemasonry, we call it the great architect of the universe. Again, you can have any descriptor of details that you want for the great architect, or the all, the one, however you want to call it. Christians call it God. Other religions have different names, but this is the source of all geometrical figures. And when we talk about Euclid and the systematizing, and we talk about Plato and Pythagoras, they all asserted that the universe is measurable and observable. And it's through that observation that, again, it's kind of an interpolation where you're working backwards, a deduction of from point A back to point, or I guess it would be point D from back to point A, where we're working backwards to see that everything has unity. And this is an axiom of geometry. The second one is going to be order. Order is the proper arrangement of all the parts in a whole. Everything has its place, everything. And when we look at order, order is the right placement of that. Not just, you have to clarify, like if you say it's not in order, then you say it's chaotic or it's disorderly. Order implies that every single part has its place. So when you look at nature, you look at the universe, you don't have at least in our solar system, you don't have wayward planets just going wherever they want. There is a set order of our planets that constantly move in their rotations around the sun. They don't deviate from that. There is a proper arrangement. And these arrangements are of intelligible principles. Again, the descriptor intelligible is extremely important because that means you and I can understand it. Maybe not all of it at first, and maybe not all of it at the end, but we do have some comprehension at any given point. If you haven't looked at the night sky lately, you should go out and look at the night sky. And you will see, if you don't have a lot of light pollution, you should see the proper order of things. The day has its day, the night has its night. You see that the celestial canopy is as it should be, even if we're looking into the past with the passing of light taking so long to get to us. It all has a proper order. Order is predicated on two assumptions. So again, this is something that is taken to be as fact in the understanding of geometry. The first one is a big one, especially because in modernity and postmodernism, we see a lot of deconstructive mentality as well as absurdism. The first assumption is that the universe is not random and is structured in patterns that we can understand and are discernible. They're not a mystery to us. Now, they might be at the beginning, but if we take the time and effort, we will be able to understand those patterns and relationships. The one thing I've learned a lot in my time growing up in Masonry is that everything is about relationships. It's that space between entities, whether that space is between you and your shadow, whether it's between you and your family, your community, you and the transcendent. It is all about relationships. And it's important that if we take the assumptions and the assertions of geometry that the universe is going to be not random and it has an intelligible design to it, then we are able to take that macrocosm and look at it in the microcosm of our limited experience. The second assumption is that we can, again, observe, study, and understand it. It's what makes knowledge, order is what makes knowledge possible. So this is very epistemological. It's all about truth, right? So how do you know a thing? Brother Patrick here presented on an epistemological MPS, was it last month?
Last month?
Yeah, last month, here at our headquarters. And it's an interesting idea, like how do you know what's true? How do you know the authority you trust on is a proper authority for what you're trying to uncover? Imagine if the universe was chaotic and random. How would you know a thing? And I'm not necessarily saying that it's not, because maybe it is. But if it is random and chaotic, how do you know what you know? So I make this example. If you were coming to headquarters here in Colorado, there are certain ways you can get here, right? There are certain ways you can't get here. We are in a landlocked state in the United States, so you cannot take a boat here. That won't work. If you're coming from Denver International Airport, if you go east, you can't get here because that would put you in Kansas. If you go west, you might be able to get here, but if you go too far west, you'll end up in Utah. So I would posit that the universe is actually not random, because how would we be able to have a shared experience? We have our subjective nature and experience with nature, but we also have a shared one. How did Brother Benjamin and Brother Patrick know to come at a proper time tonight if time is chaotic and random, if it doesn't measure accordingly? So in order to have knowledge, the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, and other philosophers throughout time, and Freemasonry inclusive, would say that in order to have knowledge, you have to have order. There has to be something that is measurable and in place and shows the right relationships in order for us to not only experience objective reality, but to understand it. I would love someday to just do not an MPS, but a seminar on epistemology, because it's, how do you know a thing? Like, that will drive you crazy for a lifetime. So reality possesses objective meaning and structure. That ultimately sums up what I've been saying. So proportion. Okay, so this is the first principle of geometry. So again, we have unity, we have order, and we have proportion. Proportion is interesting, and I'll actually bring this up a little bit later with the fifth principle, which is going to be beauty. Proportion is going to be proper relationship, which, again, proper relationship is extremely important. If you have too much of something, it's too much, it's excess. If you have too little of something, it's a deficiency. So you have to have the proper positioning and the proper relationship between the parts of a particular whole, whatever it may be. One example I like, and this is actually not spiritual, well, maybe it's spiritual, I don't know, but it's not spiritual at all, is the wolves of Yellowstone. I always like that story. You know, they added wolves in some time ago into Yellowstone, and individuals were worried, scientists were worried that it would destroy the ecosystem there. And in fact, it didn't. It corrected it to a large extent, because the prey were so rampant that it was destroying land masses and water courses and all sorts of stuff. And by adding, I think it was like, do you know the number? It's like 10 or 15 wolves. You can look it up. And there was a certain number of wolves that they added to the ecosystem. And in a course of years, it corrected it, because by adding in the proper part, because wolves were very small in number at the time, it adjusted the relationship of the parts. So all the pieces that make up the ecosystem. It's that in mathematics, it's going to deal with ratios and relative measurement. So the ratio of wolves to, elk or deer or rabbits or whatever it's going to be, how does it have an interaction with the rest of the parts? So by adjusting it, you create a proper proportion. From a philosophical standpoint, it deals with balance, moderation, and the right relation of individual elements. I'm going to take back the word moderation from modernity, because moderation does not mean temperance. They are two different things. We've often been talking about that a lot here with some various brothers about the difference between moderation and temperance. Moderation is not temperance. They're two, like I said, two different things. And I'll talk more about this when we get to another section, but moderation, at least according to Aristotle, has to deal with the middle path, or the golden mean. And when you look at virtue and vice, you have, weirdly enough, we think that for every one virtue, there are two vices. No, for every one virtue, there are one vice. But really, when we look at it from a Aristotelian standpoint, it's two vices for every one virtue. And here's what I mean. When you look at moderation and the middle path, you have deficiency and you have excess. So the virtue would lie in the middle. So deficiency, for the virtue, let's say it's courage. Courage is the virtue. If you have a deficiency of courage, that makes you a coward. If you have excess, that makes you rash. Those are both vices to the one virtue. And oftentimes, I was trying to say, my mind started thinking about Aristotle, so I apologize for the momentary lapse there. But oftentimes we think of virtue and vice, it's like one for one. But really, at least according to Aristotle, it's one for two. And you can have someone that has a deficiency and another person who has rashness. But proportion would say, according to Aristotle, that we're dealing with moderation. You have just the right amount of courage that is right for the situation. So moderation is not temperance. It is not just having a little bit of here and there. It means not having too much and not having too little. It means walking that middle path. And it's also, the key part is in relationship to other things. So you can have someone who may have less courage than maybe another, but it is the right amount for the situation you have. So you don't always have to be, up in someone's face fighting the good fight. You can do it a certain way given the relationship of the situation. That's why context matters with proportion. And to the ancient Greeks, we're looking at proportion. If someone had right proportion within them, to be very wise and to offer prudence or good judgment. I'm going to stop here after the fourth principle to see if there's any comments or questions. So the next one is harmony. Again, first principle of geometry. A lot of people who are not familiar with geometry or sacred geometry would not put this in place, but it actually has a lot to do with the universe. Harmony is the unity of diverse parts working together in concert according to the common order. So we're taking the diversity and having unity with that diversity. And it's a kind of a weird mental gymnastics because you're like, well, if we're all in one, how can we be diverse? Harmony would contend that it can't. So we're looking at again, everything was the right amount or the correct way of integrating the parts into the whole. So how does, going back to the wolves in Yellowstone, how does that integration work with the rest of the whole without putting too much? I remember learning many years ago, I think it was Australia, maybe it was New Zealand, that they introduced the cow. I think it was the cow. It's been a long time since I pulled this particular knowledge out of my head. It was cow. They introduced the cow, I think it was, to the pastures, and it caused havoc on the ecosystem because that animal wasn't native to Australia or New Zealand, whatever one it was. And then ecologists added in the dung beetle because there were so many cows, there's no natural predators for cows, so they were putting a lot of their dung all over the pastures, which was causing a problem. So they added the dung beetle, but then the dung beetle got out of control, and then like so forth and so on. Like they had to keep adding things in to take care of the problem that they created. If we look at an ecosystem that naturally is, untouched by adverse interactions, it will be the correct integration. Spiders exist to kill insects, and insects live to help, with the flora and the fauna of the ecosystem. So they all have their part. But the interesting thing is harmony allows for a meaningful relationship, even though there's a difference. So the example I have in my head is the musical chord, right? The C major. And I'm a little bit outside of my element with music. So if you have musical questions, I will defer you to Brother Benjamin, because he actually has the musical degree, not me. So correct me if I'm wrong, Brother Benjamin, if I misspeak on anything. But when you look at the C major, it's a chord of 3. You have the root note, which is C. You have the major third, which is going to be E. And you have the perfect fifth, which is going to be a G. And when you play those together at the same time, am I right so far?
Correct.
I am correct. If you play those at the same time, you get a beautiful chord. And that chord is a blending of parts. But notice the C, the E, and the G do not get lost. They're not like gone. It's not like they just become a new note. They are a part of the whole, and they add their differences to each other's differences in such a complementary way that it creates a very bright and beautiful sound. That is harmony. So in geometry, all of the parts have to live in a blending of experiences in order for the whole to manifest itself. It's very synergistic, meaning that the whole is greater than its parts. So C, E, and G exist wonderfully by themselves, but when you add them together appropriately in the right relationship, in a meaningful relationship, then you get that beautiful brand new chord, which is going to be that C major. I'm going to stop here and see if there are any questions or comments from any of the platforms. And again, if you have a question on Zoom, go ahead and put it in the a chat to Brother Benjamin, and he'll be able to go through those questions. Anything from you, Brother Patrick? Brother Benjamin?
Receiving some, but they're not fully typed yet.
Okay, well, I'm going to hold off. I'll go into the next one just so we don't lose time. There's quite a bit to still cover, and I want to respect our time together. So the fifth principle of geometry is beauty. Now, I remember one time someone asked me, like, what is beauty? Like, why is it relevant? And I couldn't say, I was a lot younger then, but I couldn't say I had a great answer. Although I knew there was an answer, I knew there was a great answer. I didn't possess it. And it has always kind of hung with me because I thought it was a very interesting question. Like, I don't know, we all like to look at beautiful things. Why wouldn't it be relevant? But this individual was like, I don't see the relevancy of it, which was hard for me to kind of grok and put my head around. But when we look at beauty in a geometric sense, it is going to be a manifestation, a visible manifestation of all the four principles we just covered. So unity, order, proportion, and harmony. It's going to be all of those four together. Now, not just together like they all exist at once, but again, in that right relationship. So here you have the seed of life, and we're looking at the beauty of everything that comes out of the cosmos. You have that very visible manifestation. This is the universe's way, I believe, that it allows us to be attracted to the other four principles. Because how do you see harmony? Well, you can see it, but usually it's a beauty that will attract you first. There's some type of attraction that will bring you to seeing, order or, proportion. When I look at, this is a random comment, but when you look at the periodic table of elements, it's actually a very beautiful document. You have so many different elements in the universe that we can find at the moment, laid out in a particular order. It has a very set order of things. And if you adjust just one of the subatomic elements, which is a proton, if you adjust it just once, you get a whole new element. And then if you look at where they come from, how do you get them, their personal characteristics, but you bring them together and you create something that comes from those elements blending together. Depending on how you blend them and the ratios that you put them together, you get different things. If you add sodium and chloride together, you get table salt. The proportion is 1-to-1. For every sodium ion and every chloride, you get, table salt. If you blend them differently with different elements, you get different things. And it's so beautiful if you look at how it moves, which that seems like a very sterile example. And I get it's very specific, but I do find it very beautiful that, we can look at the universe and put them, bring it down to the elements and realize that any combination can create something unique and different from something else. One thing I would like to say is that I want to take back the phrase that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, because I don't think I fully agree with that statement. Yes, we have our certain tendencies towards like, I like that particular style of art or that particular style of, artistic medium. I prefer ballet over tap, or I prefer, Caravaggio over Leonardo da Vinci. Like, yeah, you can say there's like preferences, but, I can sit there and not be a fan of a particular piece of art, whatever it may be, whatever medium, but really still appreciate the beauty of it because there's something about it that's just amazing. I'm not a big fan of modern art. I don't care for it, but I do understand that there's a lot that goes into it. And if I try to make modern art, I don't achieve it because I'm not an artist like that. I can't do it. So I know there's skill and technique behind it. And I don't detract from the value just because I don't have a personal preference for it. So when we look at beauty in a geometric sense, everything that has the first four principles in proper relationship allows for beauty to be seen by the observer. Anything that falls outside of those tolerances, meaning the order is incorrect or that the proportions are not in the right measurements, and they're not in the right ratios, we can see that there is a tolerance, there's a limit. There's a limit on one side and a limit on the other side. And if it falls outside of that, then we tend to call it not beautiful. And so I know there's some people who are like, no, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Like, I'm not trying to strip your individual preferences away, but there is a moment, like here in the general office, we play different types of music. And unfortunately, some of them don't like my style of music. But, and I don't like some of their music, but I understand that it still takes talent and skill, and there's a beauty to it, and that there's a joy that comes from that beauty. So there's the ability to hold two thoughts that are in contrast to each other at the same time, which is, I know what I like and I know what I don't like, but that doesn't mean that what I don't like is not beautiful. Platonic thought was that beauty was a reflection of higher realities. This is very important to, as I, Platonism and Neoplatonism, that there's a higher reality. So I remember someone telling me many years ago, a coworker of mine, she was really big into nature and she loved snowboarding. And she said, I don't need to go to church. I find my God on the top of a mountain. And I have often thought about that over the years of what that meant. And, when you're sitting outside, which I hope you do tonight if you haven't done it yet, go sit outside and you just enjoy the beauty of what the cosmos represent. It takes you to places. It transports you out of your minutia of a life and just takes you to places that nothing else can. And Plato really believed that that was a part of beauty, was to transcend the manifestation that we live in. Again, philosophers in later time, they put it in a more strict kind of observation, again, that the universe participates in an intelligible order, meaning that I can perceive it, you can perceive it. It's important to us. I'm going to stop here in a second and the next slide to see if those questions and comments came in. So when we look at beauty, it's revelatory. It tells us something that is incommunicable. You can sit in the same space as someone, enjoying the same nature or whatever it is you're enjoying, and it doesn't hold the same message. It reveals something to you and your nature, whether it's subconscious, whether it's conscious, whether it provides you a peace that you didn't have. Maybe it helps you transcend a problem. But the person next to you, if you're like, man, this is a really nice night, and they're like, yeah, it is, you're talking about two different perceptions of the same nice night, because it's going to do something that reveals something totally different. And that's the beauty of it, is, no pun intended, that's the beauty of it, is that it allows you to have an experience that is shared by all, but incommunicable. It's something that's just for you. It's kind of like nature's gift for you as an individual. So to sum up the principles, the first 5 principles of geometry, and to get to Masonry, which is why we're here, unity gives rise to order. Order establishes proportion. Proportion creates harmony, and harmony reveals beauty. That is all for all of the lovers of sacred geometry or even mathematical geometry. This sums it up. Again, in a very basic way, but it is any part that is not following, if it's out of line, it destroys the way things go. You cannot have the first 4 without having the 5th. Every part is needed. Again, keeping their distinct nature. Unity is not order. Order is not proportion, and so forth and so on. But when they come together, just like the chord we talk about, the C major, it keeps its individuality while being a part of the collective. Are there questions before I get into the next part, gentlemen? Brother Benjamin.
I have a few here. So one question from Ava. Pythagoras spoke about the harmony of the spheres, correct? I think she'd like you to elaborate more on that in response to the harmony subject.
I think I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. You can find it on YouTube. It was a little bit difficult for us to find it, but we did find it. You can find that the certain frequencies that planets emit have a certain sound that is very specific to it. So I don't think necessarily that was known back in the day. It was theorized, but later on it was proven that the harmony of the spheres, you're looking at the interaction of all of the cosmos. And in this case, we'll just stay with the solar system because that's what we can kind of wrap our head around. It's hard to wrap your head around all of the universe that it contains. that the spheres lived in perfect harmony with each other. And when you see each of the planets moving around, doing its rotate or its revolution around the sun, it creates, as it turns, revolving on its axis in its orbit around the sun, it creates a certain frequency. And when you play all of the frequencies together, there is a music that is played. And it is not necessarily like, man, I'm going to put that on repeat. That's like the most amazing. It's amazing in the sense that you would not expect the solar system to be orchestral in a sense. But it's not like a modern, like, oh, wow, again, that's on my top 10 list of favorite songs ever. But it's an interesting thing because when you hear that there is a sphere going on and that sphere is making music, there's a harmony because each of the planets, excuse me, I am like dry as dry. Each of the planets are in relationship to each other. And when you look at Mercury, Venus, Mars, Earth, and so forth, they don't sacrifice who they are. So Pythagoras is looking at the fact that, the planets that he knew at the time, the classical planets, had a proper relationship to each other, whether it be an Earth-centric or, as Copernicus helped us out and whatnot, it's sun-centric, that it had a relationship with each other that allowed for the harmony of the spheres to exist, that each planet was allowed to be itself without jeopardizing a planet of another. And that is harmony, that we can all exist as we are without jeopardizing the space of another. Now, Ava, I'm sure you probably want something a little bit more detailed, but I think on a very cursory level, that answers the part where harmony is in everything. Right now, harmony in the office, harmony maybe at home, harmony in nature, everything is as it should be, unless it's not. And then we have to fix it, which is the later part of my presentation. Brother Benjamin?
Yeah, so I've got another question here from Samuel. He says he has one question. It ties to the Yellowstone wolves and how nature does piece together perfectly to create our reality. Where does the line get drawn where nature pushes us to be stewards, for example, by placing the wolves in Yellowstone and saved it? But I don't believe there was that was nature trying to say the puzzle aspect isn't real, just nature pushing us to be active participants in the ecosystem. Where does the line get drawn?
I can't tell you a hard and fast line, but I will tell you that nature is constantly correcting itself. So the fact that the wolves diminished in population and before new ones were added, nature did correct itself in the sense of like there were more deer. That is a byproduct of a different set of conditions. It wasn't like you had no wolves and the deer population stayed low. So nature corrects, and it is in a correct proportion to the problem at hand, which is there's a lack of predation in Yellowstone. Where the line of stewardship comes in is we have kind of a before and after perspective. It's like, well, this is what Yellowstone looked like before, and now this is what it looks like after. And yes, there is a new, I struggle to say equilibrium because equilibrium means something very different, but there's a new norm. But we don't want that new norm. We want the norm that it was before. So as a steward, we go back and try to eliminate our impact as human beings and correct what mistakes were made. So whether it was, hunting of the wolves or starvation of the wolves or whatever it was that caused that population to drop, I don't remember now. But as stewards, we like to go back and put things before we got involved. That is the line of stewardship. Now, if we look at nature, in suburbia, I would say it's not as great as in the mountains. But if you look at nature, it has adapted to its new surroundings. But what we've tried to do is we try to put trees in and grass in, and we try to bring back parks. We try to change things in a way that is going to establish a somewhat original context. So the line, I can't give you a hard and fast one, but typically as stewards, we like to put things back to what they were as much as we can, knowing full well that we'll never be able to be without, and can never get it back to what it was pre-human touching. Brother Benjamin?
I have another question.
And then we'll go Brother Patrick.
Brother Maya. Would you say these principles primarily relate to the material level of reality? Can evil forces or persona use unity, order, harmony, proportion, and beauty for its ends also? Discrimination is needed to truly see the difference between goodness and evil and its use in these principles.
That's a great question, Brother Maya. It depends on how you want to approach it. So back in, Pythagoras and Plato, and we're looking back then, I would argue that these are inherent principles. These are things that are not changing. I often think of Lord of the Rings when Samwise Gamgee is hanging out with Frodo. If you haven't seen the movie, you should, movies. And he's saying something, correct me if I'm wrong, Brother Benjamin, something to the effect of like, look, Mr. Frodo, there's still some good in the world, because he's looking up at the sky and the clouds are breaking apart, the dark clouds of evil, if you will. And it's breaking apart and he's seeing the celestial canopy and he's like, yeah, there's still goodness in this world that the evil cannot touch. And I would argue that as humans, it is a tool, discernment, but there's also consciousness. There's different levels of consciousness. There is good and there is the lack of good. There is excess of evil and deficiency of evil, which makes that good. So can it interact? I think that's a metaphysical comment or question. Depends on what you believe. I would argue, from at least from a Pythagorean and Platonic sense, that the evil, that there is no evil. It's the lack of goodness, because back to Plato, he believed in forms. So goodness being good being the form of all forms. There's a hierarchy of forms. It's the highest of them all. And that if you have evil was just a progression of less and less good in a given space. As humans, we have to judge what's good and evil. We have no other way to discern. So it depends on your metaphysical platform on how you would approach that. I would say some very spiritual people would say, yeah, there's definitely evil in this world. And the materialist, probably not, because there's how is Yellowstone evil? Or how is, the ocean's bad? So it just depends on your perspective. Does geometry just apply to the material? I'm going to argue that it doesn't. I'm going to spend the latter half of the presentation saying it's beyond the material. My metaphysical framework is not a materialist. I don't believe in just the physical realm. I believe it's a part of reality. I don't think it is reality, and there is a difference with that. Brother Patrick.
All right, so I have one question here from YouTube. Someone said or asked, in terms of proportion, wouldn't proportion also be the same as removing the weight or burden in all aspects to gain balance in order to restore harmony?
You can't remove weight because everything has weight. And that can be meant physically, or that can be meant spiritually, mentally, emotionally. Everything has a gravitas to it. Now, some of it can be negligible, or it can be extremely profound, depending on what you're looking at. The removal of weight is, I would argue, I was just rewatching Star Wars series. I was watching it with my 5-year-old the other day, and it was the Clone Wars. If you've never watched it, I highly recommend it. They have like these quotes on the front of every episode that I just love to read. And one of them is that it is purpose over feeling. And another one was the purpose is not to survive life, it's to overcome the obstacles. And I think this second one is more indicative of the question, in that by just removing the weight, you're not overcoming the obstacle. You're trying to eliminate the impact. What you'll find in masonry and in life is that you have to move through the impact. I'm really going to cast myself as a complete dork, which is totally fine. I'm going to quote Dune here and do the fear is the mind killer. We have so much fear within us that we just want to remove the problem instead of moving through it. And if we move through it, as we see in the Dune trilogy, at least the movies, if you haven't read the books, they're really good. You have to move through the obstacle. So removing weight to restore balance, the universe has weight. You can't remove it to restore balance. It's like saying removing, the deer restores balance to Yellowstone. It doesn't. It changes the context, and you have to refine the norm. And the norm isn't going to go back to ever what it was unless you put the deer back into the equation. It's like saying, if you have 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, the Pythagorean theorem, if you remove 4 squared, then you'll have a balance, and that won't work. Everything is in right proportion because everything has a weight to it. So I would contend, no, you cannot remove something and reestablish a proportion. Ratio requires that each number has a weight of its own. 2 has a specific weight to 4. And when we look at the proportion of 2 over 4, right? 4 is twice the amount of weight as 2. And that proportion is extremely important because it gives you what 1/2 looks like. How does 1/2 feel? I want you in your mind, like, how does 1/2 feel to 1/3? One should feel a little bit less than the other because 1/2 is not equal to 1/3, right? 1/2 is 50%. 1/3 is 33%. They are not the same weight. So we have to move through the obstacle, not try to avoid the obstacle. Brother Benjamin, any other questions from your side? These are great questions, by the way. Thank you.
A question from Brother Eka. All the axioms used as a starting point for geometry are taken as true without proof. So exact science is based on something that is not tested. Is this interesting architecture somewhat reflected in the reflection of geometry in Freemasonry? And if so, how?
I got the first half. I don't think I understand the second half. Do you understand the second half of the question? Brother Eka, can you please clarify the second part of the question in the chat for Brother Benjamin? Because I get the first part. And it was interesting because I was just with a bunch of brothers on the West Coast and we were talking about faith, and I had asked the question if faith was intrinsic to humanity. And brother was like, absolutely. But I think faith is also found in dogs, which I thought was very specific. But I think she meant like animals in general. And I was like, I don't know if dogs have faith, right? And the reason why I bring this up is not so much to talk about whether dogs have faith or animals in general, but it is that faith in and of itself is a confidence in a system. You cannot live life trying to prove everything because you can't. You cannot prove. There are certain principles that you have to take on faith. That I would argue that faith is intrinsic to human characteristic, not to kingdom animalia, not to the rest of the kingdom. It's something that specifically makes us unique and human, which is faith. So these first principles, if you don't believe in unity, you can go out and look and test it, and maybe you find out that there's not unity. Maybe you do find out. That was the contention of the Pythagoreans and the Platonists, is that if you don't take my word for it, go out and look in nature and see if you find unity. When I sit under the sky in Colorado, or we were just talking about Italy today, if I sit under the sky in Italy, it's the same damn sky. There's a unity in it, and it's the same cosmos. I might be looking at it from a different perspective, but I can go compare and I can go look at that. Did she clarify the second half of that question for us? Okay, Brother Eka, we'll come back to you. Is there any more questions before we move? Okay. It is so dry here. All right, let's get to the second half of our presentation. I told you that I was going to kind of burn fast through the first principles of geometry because I wanted to kind of lay some foundational work for us. But ultimately, like, how does this relate to Freemasonry? Because that's why we're all here. Like, great, I love sacred geometry. It's awesome. Why do I care about it in terms of Freemasonry? Well, let me make a bridge for you. So many years ago, I was sitting down and I was contemplating Freemasonry. And there was a question of like, okay, well, the two assumptions I gave you. Freemasonry is a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbol. Okay, that's the definition of Freemasonry. You can look it up anywhere and that's what it says. Okay. And then we see William Preston and Anderson's Constitutions saying that at its foundation, Freemasonry is geometry. And again, in the modern sense, I think they're talking both sacred and secular geometry. And I just trying to reconcile those two because it's like, when I think of morality, I'm not thinking of, geometry. Like when you sit there and be like, is a circle moral? I don't think that's, my mind couldn't go there. And then I had this other question that was kind of out in the ethers. It was kind of, it's, how you kind of live in a slideshow where it's like each thought's a different slide and sometimes they're not connected. That's kind of how it was, where I had one thought that out here, this question that really was the answer to my first, meditations of like, how is this all related? And it took a long time before, I saw the obvious. How does geometry relate to Freemasonry? The bridge is architecture. Because the question that was sitting out on this other slide elsewhere in the notebook of my head is that like, why the building craft? When you think about Theodosius, blocking and stopping all the pagan religions in 300 AD, I think it was 383 or something like that AD. Theodosius the first says no more pagan religions outside of Christianity. Like the rest, kibosh. And if you try to practice it, we will either kill you, imprison you, or make your life miserable. So I was like, okay, I get the history of that, but like, why would Freemasonry like hide in architecture to be preserved? That doesn't make sense to me. And it's very, we have the manuscripts. We know that Masonry comes through the building guilds, but like, why? Like, why that of all places? And the answer is right there on the slide for you. It's the natural application of geometry. So if Masonry is predicated on geometry, the natural application would make sense, because it doesn't matter what obedience an individual belongs to, whether they live in the theoretics, it's still an applied science. Geometry, and even, secular and sacred geometry, if you want to divide it, they're both applied. Like, why do you learn about phi? Because it's just great information to have? Like, no, you should apply it. Like all the stuff that that only like go apply it. That's why we're here. And Masonry is an active ritual. It is an active, that's why it's solar. Solar means because you have two different types of ritual. You have solar and lunar. You'll see that more of the pagan communities, such as Wiccan and whatnot, is going to be more of a lunar. They deal with things that are more of the night, of the moon, circular, whatnot. Masonry is active. It is solar. It is square. It's moving in a certain direction. And so it made sense once I put my two slides together in my head. I was like, oh, that's why. Because we want to apply something. We want to apply the first principles of geometry that we were, given, bequeathed by the various ancient schools. Like, why learn? Like, I've tried to sit down. I will confess, I have not read Elements. I have tried to read Elements. I have it on my shelf. It is definitely a tome of just text. And why have it if we're not going to apply it? And what better way to apply it than architecture? The one thing that came to my mind is many years ago, I was in Athens, and I was, talk about architecture. There's so much there. And, just looking at the various Greek architecture that was there in Athens, and we had the opportunity to go to see the Oracle of Delphi and enjoy that experience. Like, that is geometry in play. It's living geometry. The consciousness of first principles moving through stone it's impressive. So the bridge between Freemasonry as a moral system and geometry as, in the modern sense of secular science, is actually architecture. I'm not going to go very big into architecture because I want to spend some good time with Freemasonry. Again, that's why we're here. So I want to go to Vitruvius, who was a Roman architect, which gave us three principles. And Vitruvius gave us the idea that you have strength, which is the principle of endurance. And if you look here, I have the Doric column, which represents strength. If you notice, it's very austere looking. It looks like it's supports, right? So he says a building must have stability and it must have permanence, right? So when you think about, I've never built a building before. That's not true. I've helped building a building before, but I'm not an architect. Like, I don't know how to put rules together. I was just asking my husband the other day how to put a line in the flower bed without sprinkler system, and, having to deal with that. But when you look at the principle of endurance, it has to have stability and it has to have principle. And me not understanding, basic architecture, it's really hard for me to build something. I can take something that's already built and refurbish it. I can fix it. I can, renovate it. But to build something, right, it has to have permanence and it has to have stability. And when we look at the strength, you have to have a foundation. This goes to the weight question that was asked in a very weird kind of Aquarian way, where you have a foundation. A foundation is a system of different supports. So the concrete slab, the walls, the buttresses. And what it does is it distributes the weight of the building across a surface area. Okay, right now we're talking geometry, we're talking mathematics. We're going to take this in a minute to something much more transcendent than those. So you have to have a building that can bear the weight, or excuse me, a foundational system that can bear the weight of the edifice you're trying to construct. That's the principle of endurance. How do you do it? You have to have right order. You have to have correct proportions. You have to have a source. You have to have all these things in place in right relation in order for there to be strength. You have utility. Utility is purpose. Okay. It is going to be a purpose. It has to have all of those parts working towards that purpose. So if you are building a shed, okay, would it make sense for it to have a part to be a fountain? Does a fountain work towards storage? Probably not. Likewise, if you're building, you're doing your landscaping, your lawn, or you're working on something that is beautifying, do you want to put a shed in there? Probably not. So you're looking at something that has to have purpose, but all the parts have to work towards that purpose. And I want you to keep that utility in mind, because that's going to be a really big part of the last third of this presentation. And then, of course, Vitruvius says you have to have beauty. And in his sense, this is the principle of visible expression of order. So we're tying in that idea of order. When I didn't say it with utility, which is the principle of purpose, you have the reason why I chose to do a Ionic column, that capital with the scrolls, is because it's wisdom on purpose. You have to be wise on what the purpose is. When you're building a building physically, you have to know the purpose of it, which means you need to understand purpose. You need to have some foresight, some vision, something that you're pulling out of the realm of forms and trying to put into matter. So that would be utility. Again, beauty is going to be the principle of visible expression of order. And I chose Corinthian. So these are going to be the Greek columns, not the Roman, which have composite, and Tuscan, which are blends of the various three. You have beauty, which is Corinthian. And if you look at the Corinthian, you can say that you may prefer strength or the utility over the beauty, but the column for beauty is pretty awesome. And if you notice, all of the pieces are in right proportion. So Vitruvius says that when you're building a building, it is to elevate one's spirit. It shouldn't be something that looks like modern architecture, if you will. So I want to do an example or a test. I'm going to show you some different architecture, and I just want you to take survey of how you feel when I show you the different architectures. So here you have a bunch of different architectures. You have my favorite cathedral in the middle, which is Le Chart. Big fan of that one. But you have Petra, which I also love. And then you have on the upper right corner of your screen is going to be some Indian architecture. And then on the bottom right is going to be some Russian architecture. And I just want you to look at it. First off, pick the one that you like the most. And if you don't like any of them, pick the one you like the most out of the least. Okay? And look at them and ask yourself, how do they make you feel? Now, Petra, which this is not the greatest picture, but it was hard to get them all in. Petra is like amazing to me because it's just built into stone, like go to Jordan and it's just built into a rock. Like, I'm like, man, can I build that? Can I, like, what was the purpose? And when I look at, Petra, it's like, man, what was the purpose? Why did they build this? And when I look at Le Chart, it's like, that's Gothic architecture's crazy to me because it's, Rococo. Like, if you look at all the different architectures, like, they're impressive, even if you're not like Gothic might be a bit too much for you. I find Rococo to be a little over the top, but I still, it's still amazing. Like, you look at it and you can sense beauty in it. You can sense like the Indian and the Russian architecture. Like, they're similar. You can see some similarities in them, but they all have the right proportions. What if, if you take the Russian architecture on the bottom right and you make one sphere a little too wide and one a little too tall? Like, how would it look? If Petra had columns that weren't the height that they were, it's a massive architectural feat in stone. Like, how would it be able to hold the weight of its structure? So take survey of how you feel. And I want you to do it in contrast to this. This is called big box retail architecture, which is modern architecture, at least at the lowest level. If you look at modern architecture, there are some wonderful feats across the world that I'm just like, wow, that's impressive. But I took the lowest form because there is architecture from every level. How do these make you feel? They have purpose. The utility is much stronger than maybe the other two, but I mean, it has purpose, and utility, and it has strength because it has a system that can carry it. But it's, you know, to some, perhaps that is beautiful. I've never met anyone, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. But it has a totally different feel to it. So let's take this into the topic of tonight's presentation, the measure of man. Okay. If you were to make yourself a building, you are an architectural feat. Would you be more akin to one of these? Or are you more like these? And there's people all over the place. There's architectures I didn't show that maybe you're more in line with. What do you look like as a building? It's a weird question, but what do you look like? I want you to take a moment and say, okay, that's what I'd look like. Well, and then I want you to envision, what do you want to look like? Is it the same image of what you are? Now ask yourself, if they're not, why? And if they are you sure? When we look at Freemasonry and we look at understanding why moral and spiritual development is predicated on geometry, hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. Because geometry is nature's laws that are observable, repeatable, and reproducible, excuse me. It's nature's law made visible. When we look at architecture, it's the application of those laws. I've said that. And then when we look at Freemasonry, we can thank many of the individuals, like recent history with Wilmshurst back. You can even say Manly P. Hall. You can take people that back into time where they said, okay, well, if geometry is an intelligible universe and architecture is the formation of that intelligible universe by human hands, then let's apply those same principles to the human soul. So Freemasonry, when we look at why is it predicated on geometry, because it's telling us a pathway to create ourselves as a building that we want to be. And so when we look at this, there has to be a lot of introspection, a lot of honesty with yourself of what is wonderful about you and what needs to change. How is the unity in your life? How is your order? Do you have the right proportions? In Masonry, we're taught all the time to have a right proportion between labor and refreshment. You know, that we're supposed to strive to make sure that everything is in accordance. Because if you work too much, all you modern people out there that work too much, it's not that you shouldn't work at all, but you should work with the right amount of time. You need to sleep. You need to enjoy life. And maybe you do enjoy your work and you're the lucky one that gets to. Maybe you hate your job, but you have to have it to pay the bills. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy life and that you shouldn't have the right proportion of labor, enjoyment, and work, or sleep, I should say. So how are you living those lives? How is it impacting you as an individual? Do we have any questions before we move on?
I think I did.
So geometry is going to be nature. Architecture, as we know, is going to be building. Freemasonry is about becoming. Again, it's if you look at that visual, this is who you are now. This is who I am now as a building. Sometimes I feel like a Walmart building. I'm just like, ugh, underwhelming at best. And then I look at, you know, Petra, and I'm just like, God, you know, as an Aquarian, I want to be unique, and Petra's so unique, and I want to be that. And it's like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be that, you know. But how do I go from what I am to what I'm supposed to be? That's Freemasonry. It's becoming that edifice that you're supposed to be. We are not all supposed to be the same style of architecture, but we are supposed to follow the same rules of the geometric game, which is, again, unity, order, harmony, proportion, beauty. It's all there for every one of us. So what is the measure of man? This is three-pronged. The first one is morality. Morality is the body of principles that an individual uses to discern right from wrong. I will contend, as Brother Maya brought up in her great question, there is a right and there is a wrong. Okay. Now, objectively, there are the right ways to do things, and objectively the wrong way to do things. There's also like personal preference. You need to figure out the two. Okay. There's a difference. Just because I like something and that's what I prefer doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it wrong. You have to figure out if it is right or if it is wrong. Okay. That morality is essential for us finding the good, the true, and the beautiful, which are three Platonic forms. And when I say forms, I mean it as ideals, is what we would call it today. It helps us get to that. Remember, the good is highest out of all the Platonic forms. So when we look at anything that has the word ness, N-E-S-S, that's an action that makes it a verb. So goodness is the act of being good. Trueness is the act of something being true. And beautifulness is the act of beauty in motion. So when we look at this, that's morality. It is your principles at play trying to help you navigate. It's trying to get you to move from the wrong, whatever that may be, into the right. Then you have character, the sum total of your individual. It is your ethics. This is how you play out morality in relationships. I would say it is morality in relationships. That would be ethics, right? Someone can be very moral and not ethical. Ethics tends to be kind of a societal agreement. You know, there's certain ethics in different country, but there's also ethics of your own. Like you can follow society's ethics and have a totally different set of ethics and not be an unethical person. So it's kind of it's a big place to play. So character is going to work with who am I becoming? Every action, every thought, because every thought is the seed for an action, is if you feed it, right? You can think some things and never come true, but if you feed it with enough thought, nutrients, then it will become an action. It will birth an action out of you. Every action is bringing you into that edifice. When we all die, which we all will, you will die a certain type and style of building. That building is what every action puts you through, meaning that you were building stone by stone, piece of wood by piece of wood. That action was bringing you into who you would die as. So you have morality, you have character, and then you have integrity. This is going to be all of your parts coming together in one whole frame. It's your coherence of your character, which again, your character is going to be predicated on your morality. So I would say it's the unity of your morality, the coherence of your character. Integrity today has come to mean, you know, are you honest? But integrity really means wholeness. Are you whole? So if you look at it, I like to think of integrity as like mortar, right? Where you're you're sealing the bricks and the stone in with mortar. That's integrity. If you do not have integrity, that means your mortar isn't quite right. And truth has a part to play in it. Honesty has a part to play in it, but there's something that has thinned out your mortar that doesn't allow it to be cohesive, or has made it so thick that it's becoming a stone unto itself. So when we look at this is what the measure of a man is. This is the measurement of you and I. Morality is how you see yourself, and in an honest, sensible way. Character is how others see you. And integrity is how the great architect sees you, the complete state of wholeness. And I use the circumpunct here as a symbol because when you look at all of these together, there's the limits, which are those two pillars. There's the limits of your morality, character, and integrity. That center, that point, there's that geometrical sign. That point is dimensionless, and it reaches all of the circumference. It reaches everything. Okay, so when we look at this with morality, we're asking what is right. With character, we're asking who are we becoming, and with integrity, am I living consistently with what I know what is right? So this is a constant self-reflection. So when something happens and you say, it's kind of what we say in science, like quality control, quality assurance. It's like, did I do right? Did I do the right thing? Now, that doesn't mean you don't have a negative outcome, because oftentimes the right thing is always rewarded with, pushback. But it's an evaluation of every situation. Another, again, very profane example that comes to my mind is a crime scene. When you see a crime scene, you're putting all the evidence together and you're trying to understand if all of the parts make sense to the story that's being told. And is it consistent? Is the evidence consistent to what is being told? Is the evidence of your life, all the actions, thoughts, and experiences that you have, is it consequent with the story that you tell yourself about who you are? If not, which I would argue most of us, it's not, we have to reconcile that. And typically, hopefully, you're going off of what the evidence is telling you and not what you think your story is. So this gets to a question about principles and virtues, because we've been talking a lot about principles. And principles and virtues oftentimes get blended together, kind of lumped together as synonyms. And they can be shared. Like a principle can be a virtue, like justice, which is very much a principle. When you look at principles, these are going to be universal. They're going to be cosmic. What is cosmic truth? What is universal justice? When we look at it in the term of a virtue, that is, how do I live justly? How do I act with truth? How do I know what I know is true? Right? Going back to the epistemological discussion. So principles, what is the difference? Principles are universal foundations. Right? They are unchangeable. They're inherent to the system. That's why they're called first principles of geometry, first principles of architecture, first principles of Freemasonry. It doesn't matter if you believe in them, they'll still exist, right? So you're like, I don't believe in justice. Well, just because you don't believe in it doesn't absolve justice from existence. It doesn't matter what we think, which burns. I know we hate that when people are like, it doesn't matter what you think. In principles, they exist unto themselves. Okay, so they're the foundation and the governing ideas of the universe. Virtues are going to be excellences of character. So principles, they're going to be your morality, and virtues are going to be your character. Right? So when we look at virtues, they are going to be what governs, or hopefully governs, the soul. If you remember, I had mentioned virtues with Aristotle a little bit, early on in this presentation. And when we look at virtues, you have to understand the right measure, the proportion of that virtue, which is what Aristotle was trying to say. Do you have an excess of something? Do you have a deficiency of something? Or are you just on the mark? That's the sacred geometry of golden mean. You're right in that sweet spot, that fulcrum point that if you went one way or the other would tip the lever. So you're looking at excellences of character. So if you want to build like wisdom on truth, so again, you have that hermaphroditic, God, I'm getting tired. The hermetic, that's the word I'm looking for. The hermetic law, which is going to be all truths are but half truths. That's because we're limited. We haven't found and excavated and mined out the truth. But as we observe the cosmos, as we try to understand and discern nature's laws, the truth reveals ourselves. And the circumpunct is a lot about truth being that point in the middle, and the circumference of the circle being the perception of that truth. Truth, if you can find the truth of a situation, you tend to act with wisdom. And in Masonry, we're constantly trying to say, okay, well, how much of that opinion is really just my belief of a thing, and how much of it is actual knowledge of the thing? And if you have truth, doesn't mean you'll have wisdom, but you're closer to acting with wisdom, and so forth and so on. So when you look at principles and virtues, they are very, very different from one another. And this brings us into what Freemasonry is trying to do. And then we'll stop for questions here at the end. So I made up this name. This is not something like I don't think if you Google you'll find, but this is the emanation of spiritual architecture. And when I say spiritual architecture, I also mean moral architecture, or sacred geometry. This is ultimately the emanations from it. So emanations, if you're not familiar with that, means that you come from a single point and push outward into manifestation. So remember when we were talking about architecture with Vitruvius, we were saying that a building must have purpose. Well, where does that purpose come from? Freemasonry would say your metaphysical framework, your worldview. So if I asked you, what is it that you place your entire worldview on? That's your metaphysical basis. The easiest one is materialism. What you see is what you get. Everything out there is exactly what is. There's nothing that is beyond it. I would contend, and I think Freemasonry would support, that there's more beyond the material. So when you look at the purpose, when I ask you the question, what purpose does your building serve? Can you answer the question? Some of you can, some of you can't. And if you say, well, my purpose is to serve the transcendent, the great architect, God, whatever the descriptor is, well, what does that mean? Like that's a great answer. I mean, it's a good answer, but it's not a great answer because that's kind of just like, well, you know, whatever I do, hopefully, is in the service of this transcendent idea. No, look at it and say, okay, what is the purpose? Because from the purpose, you will find the unity of principles. Your principles, your first principles, are steeped in your purpose, which is that metaphysical framework, that worldview that you have. It's going to be steeped in that. So what are your first principles? If I were to ask you to write me down your first principles, what are they? Do you even know what they are? This takes some self-reflection. So you have first principles. From principles, you have morality. And those morality is going to give you the individual blueprint. So principles are going to give you the design. So the divine design. So you have the divine, the purpose, right? Given to you by the divine. You have principles, which is going to be the divine's design for you. You have morality, which is the blueprint. So at some point, whoever you think does it, the transcendent is my guess, gives you a blueprint that says, this is who you are, right? Then you are going to have your character, and that character is going to be the building of that specific blueprint, okay? So you have order, which is going to be your morality. You have proportion, which is going to be your character. How are you building your structure? This is human spiritual architecture in play. That's what Freemasonry is. It's trying to get you to build the building you're supposed to be. Because right now you may just be a big box retail commercial site. I would contend that you're not. You're something else. So you need to start taking apart things that are there. You need to start putting things in its right proportion. And character is going to be that building. So if you are deficient in some part of your character, which we all are in some way, you have to fix it. You have to first identify it, right? The idea of the only way you know you have a problem is if you recognize you have a problem. You have to say it out loud. I have a problem with fill in the blank. Fix it. If you notice, you have, for character, you have a mallet and a chisel. You're pushing away those knobs and excrescences that you don't want. The morality is a spirit. It helps you learn how to follow by divine law, whatever that divine law is telling you, the good and evil, the limits of good and evil. And the principles is that book and pencil. It's helping you write down the design that has been given to you. When we look at integrity is going to be the soundness of your construction. So this is a plumb bob, right? So when you hold a plumb bob by a string and it hangs with a heavy weight, if your basis is off center, it's going to show, right? I think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You can still stand, but is it correct? Are you standing within the integrity that you should have? And then again, that beauty is going to be that Corinthian column, that capital, where if all of this is in line, you have a very beautiful edifice. And let us tie this back to sacred geometry. I added in one more part of, which was the divine, that purpose, which I pulled from Vitruvius, excuse me. So you see unity. Unity is going to be your principles. It's going to be the purpose, principles. Unity is going to be the principles. Order is the morality. Proportion is the character. Harmony is integrity, and beauty is beauty. Now, when we look at this is, again, geometry in play. And it's in play through stone, through moral character, through who you are as an individual. And ultimately, what this brought me to, before we go to the last slide and questions, if there are any, is it made me think of Michelangelo and his ability to sculpt. I mean, the guy was impressive in other areas too, but I think of just sculptor, being a sculptor, and what is as this piece of stone, what am I supposed to be? And Freemasonry is the person trying to pull the edifice out of the quarry, trying to get that stone. You know, if you look at the quarry, you know, analogy, there's a lot of metaphors, not analogies, but a lot of metaphors moving around here. But the quarry is going to be the design that comes from the great architect, and you're given tools, and masonry helps you understand how to use those tools. It doesn't tell you, you know, now you need to take a left, and now you need to take a right. Now go in this. It doesn't tell you. It says, here are the tools. This is how you use them. Go use them. Oftentimes I hear Freemasonry being a thou shalt philosophy rather than a thou shalt not philosophy. And we're looking at taking the spiritual emanations of this architecture and pulling who you're supposed to be out of the unknown stone. It is the hope of Freemasonry that by the time that you transition into the next life, whatever it may be, that you have built the edifice that you were supposed to build by taking yourself out of the quarry and out of the root stone and creating a perfected building, a perfected man. That is ultimately how geometry applies. By looking at all of the universe, we can sit there and say, well, we were just talking yesterday about virtues, and it's like, well, can I have every virtue, whatever, however many number you want to pull out? Can I have every virtue at 100% without sacrificing the 100% capacity of another virtue? Can I do that? If I can't, why? And if I can, how? And there's this process of ultimately trying to build an excellence of character, an excellence of the soul, and using order and proportion and harmony and putting it into play by architectural designs allows us to build what we're supposed to build. And that is why Freemasonry is a moral and spiritual system predicated on the principles of geometry. That is why it is our noble science. That is why we see it everywhere. And you can look in the specific rabbit holes of, you know, all the different types of sacred geometry, the Platonic solids, you know, all the other ones that are out there. You will find ways that you can apply that. That's what you need to do. You need to find the ways to apply it. How does learning the seed of life or Metatron's cube, how does that make me more principled? How does that make me have more integrity? How, and there's an answer there. It's not that I'm saying it's superfluous effort. I'm saying you have to find how to apply it for it to be relevant. There's a quote that I want to finish up with before we go to any last questions. It's from Michelangelo when he was building the David, or sculpted the David. And I changed some words in here because it didn't say not me, it said not David. And so it's simple, he said. I just removed everything that was not me. And that is what you need to do, is all of the stuff that is laboring around you, that's causing weight. It's not you. Get rid of it. Put it in the right proportion. Put it in the right place. Maybe it is you. It's just in the wrong spot. Maybe you have too much of it or not enough. You just have to be able to look at yourself with a critical eye that is constructive. Not that, and constructive doesn't mean I'm just telling you that, you know, enabling you, I mean like, oh, you're great at every level. No, constructive means that I'm looking at myself and I'm saying, you know, I need a little bit more courage, or man, I am way too quick to trust. You know, I have excess of trust. You know, it's to look at yourself and say, who am I? What am I becoming? And how do I remove everything that is not me? That is how geometry and Freemasonry come together in a unified system that is all built on a design. So I'm going to stop here and see if there's any other questions before we close out for the evening.
I have one question from Brother Diane. Going back to the topic of columns. If Masonry has King Solomon's temple as a base, why do we not study the different column styles of Egypt, the cultural center at that time, instead of ancient Greece?
Because we come from a Western esoteric tradition, which means we're going to be built out of Greece and a Hellenistic Egypt, if you will, which is going to have Greek influence. Masonry doesn't say that, you know, all of this just starts in Greece. It's just where it's where it chose its starting point in its modern sense. If you want to take these symbols back, you can, and some esoteric traditions do. Rosicrucians, you'll find a lot of Egyptian influence. In some of the Masonic rites, like Memphis, Mizraim, have a lot of Egyptian influence in it. So it's just a starting place. It's a baseline that someone said, this is where we're going to start and move forward. I wouldn't say that there was any other reason outside of we needed a place to start, because ultimately you would have to go back to the very beginning of philosophies to figure out exactly where that lineage comes from. And I do believe you could do that if you had the time and effort. You could look at it and say, okay, well, the Egyptian, Egypt had a lot, massive influence on all things Greek. You have people of great significance visiting Egypt and trying to be initiated into their rites, which, by the way, many of them were not allowed to. You had to be Egyptian to do it, and they wouldn't let you in. So that's part of the reason why we start with Greece, is because that's the one that we have the most record of. Any other questions?
I have one from a while back that we didn't get to circle back to, from Ava. She was talking about Pythagoras. Didn't Pythagoras believe that the universe was created or sustained by its harmony? It's similar to symbolism. It's weird. There we go. By J.R.R. Tolkien, where the universe is sounding into existence, which also have The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. What are your thoughts?
Pythagoras believed in harmony for sure, but he believed in other parts of it too. It wasn't just like that was the one thing only. So yeah, he believed that the universe, you can't have the cosmic relationship that we see that holds all life as it is suspended in, the vast universe without harmony. But what are you harmonizing? If it's just harmony, like, well, harmony requires parts. What are the parts? And how are those parts arranged? And are those parts in the right amount of arrangement, meaning proportion? So yes, he believed in harmony as a major component, but it was more of an outcome, not necessarily a standalone in its existence. So it was more complicated than that. And a very brief answer. All right, we are at a little over our time. I want to appreciate everyone for coming out this evening or in the morning or whatever time of night and day it is for you. Thank you for spending your time here at the Masonic Seminar Series. I want to thank Brother Patrick and Brother Benjamin for their time as always, as they help me maneuver through all the tech and all that, which I wouldn't be able to do while presenting. We will be meeting next month. Last year, we typically do not operate in July and August, but I do think we should be here in July. We will not be here in August, as we have our massive convention in the first 2 weeks of August. So we will be in here for July. I hope you will join us for the next episode of the Masonic Seminar Series. Have a